Okay, so get this. We are diving headfirst into something that's got everyone talking.
Right.
Bitcoin and the 2024 U.S. presidential election. It's November 5th, Election Day. And the crypto world, well, let's just say it's buzzing.
Yeah, it really is, fascinating how these two worlds are kind of colliding right now.
Right.
We've got an article from crypto.news. Bitcoin could rally to $80,000 on the eve of U.S. elections. That's their prediction.
$80,000. I mean, come on, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do today is cut through all the noise, all the hype.
Right.
And really try to figure out how this election might actually impact Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, believe it or not, the outcome of this election and the price of Bitcoin, they could be way more connected than you think.
Yeah, it's true. And we're going to explore exactly why. And I think a really interesting place to start is in this world of crypto prediction markets.
Oh, yeah.
So these are sites like Polymarket and Kalshi. And it's basically where people put their money where their mouth is.
Right.
And bet on who they think is going to win.
And here's the crazy part. On both platforms, Trump is the favorite. Polymarket gives him a 61.1% chance of winning, while Kalshi has him at 56.8%.
Wow.
Now, obviously, these prediction markets are not a perfect crystal ball. They don't always get it right. But it does give us a really interesting snapshot into what crypto traders are thinking.
Yeah, it's like taking the temperature of the crypto community.
Exactly.
And right now, it seems like, well, a lot of them are feeling pretty good about a Trump victory.
Which makes you wonder, right? Like, why? Why is Trump's potential win seen as such a positive thing for Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Is it just because of his personality, or is there something more to it?
It's probably a bit of both, honestly. I mean, Trump has been pretty vocal about being pro-crypto. Remember that speech he gave at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He basically said that he wants to make the U.S. a Bitcoin superpower.
Oh, yeah. He was talking about creating a national Bitcoin reserve, making the U.S. the leader in Bitcoin mining. I mean, you could just tell, like, he sees it as a very valuable asset.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, we've got Harris, right? And she's taking more of a measured approach. Her opportunity agenda for black men actually mentions crypto, but the details are pretty thin on the ground. So you can see why some crypto investors might be a little bit on edge.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're right. A candidate's, like direct support, it can definitely impact the price in the short term.
Sure.
But ultimately, the influence they have long term comes down to the policies that they put in place.
Exactly, yeah. So we're talking things like inflation, how the U.S. interacts with other countries when it comes to crypto. Is it easy for people to invest in digital assets? These are the big picture things that will really shape the future of Bitcoin, regardless of who's actually in the White House.
That's a really good point. So I guess thinking about both Trump and Harris and where they stand, what kind of policies do you think would actually move the needle for Bitcoin in the long run? Like something for everyone listening to think about as we, kind of keep going down this rabbit hole?
It's a great question and one that's worth exploring. And actually, speaking of digging, let's talk about this thing called derivatives data.
Okay.
Specifically, Deribit's Bitcoin Volatility Index. Now, it's been going up steadily since late September, but it's not like going completely crazy like we saw with, other big market-moving events.
So what does that tell us then? Are traders expecting things to stay pretty calm, even with the election and everything?
Well, think of it this way, I guess. It means that a lot of these seasoned traders, the people who are usually pretty good at predicting this stuff, well, they're basically betting that the election isn't going to cause Bitcoin to totally crash or to, absolutely skyrocket.
Interesting. Okay, so they're expecting some movement, but nothing too dramatic.
Right. And get this, the data from Deribit actually shows that the $60,000 to $80,000 range, well, that has the most open interest after the election.
Okay.
Now, open interest, it's basically just the total value of all the bets placed on where Bitcoin's price will land after the votes are counted.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like they're saying like moderate increase, not this huge surge, but an increase nonetheless. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they're factoring in the potential impact of the election, but they're not getting carried away. Remember, there are a lot of other factors at play here. We've got global economics, technological developments, other countries' policies on crypto. The election's just one piece of a very complicated puzzle.
Right. So are they betting on the policies, the candidates themselves, or both?
Ooh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer that, I think we need to shift gears a little bit and talk about institutional investment, because honestly, it's playing a massive role in this whole Bitcoin election saga. And one of the most interesting things we're seeing is happening with spot Bitcoin ETFs.
Okay, so remind me, what is a spot Bitcoin ETF again?
Think of it this way. It's an easy way for big institutions like pension funds and these big investment firms to get involved in Bitcoin. Basically, it lets them invest in Bitcoin without having to actually buy and store the cryptocurrency themselves.
Got it. So what's going on with these ETFs then?
So on November 4th, there was a net outflow from these ETFs of around $541.1 million.
Wow.
Which could mean that some of these big investors are kind of, pulling back a bit just in case things get volatile after the election.
Interesting. So they're taking some chips off the table just in case things go haywire.
Precisely. But here's where the link to Trump gets really interesting. Back on October 30th, when his odds of winning were like almost 67%, these Bitcoin ETFs saw a net inflow of $893.3 million.
So when it looked like Trump was going to win, the money came pouring in. So does that mean they see a Trump presidency as being good for Bitcoin?
Possibly, but, correlation doesn't always equal causation.
Right.
There could be other factors at play there. The takeaway, I think, is that institutional investors are clearly paying attention to this election. They're watching the polls, they're analyzing the candidates, and they're making these big investment decisions based on what they're seeing.
It makes sense. So it sounds like, institutional investment. It's another piece of this puzzle. If you want to understand how the election might impact Bitcoin, you have to look at this.
Absolutely. And here's another piece of the puzzle. The current Bitcoin cycle, well, it's actually underperforming compared to previous cycles.
What do you mean by cycle?
So Bitcoin's price, it tends to go through these boom and bust cycles, often tied to something called the halving. That's basically when the rewards for mining Bitcoin get cut in half.
Right, okay.
And historically, the price has surged after each halving.
Okay, so you're saying, this time around, it's not rising as much as it has in the past.
Exactly. Which could imply that Bitcoin might actually be undervalued, even with all the gains we've seen this year.
So wait, does that mean it's primed for this huge jump?
It's definitely possible. And it raises a fascinating question. Does this potential undervaluation, coupled with all this interest from big institutions, make Bitcoin extra sensitive to the election outcome?
So you're saying because Bitcoin's kind of on sale right now and big investors are eager to get in, the election results could have an even bigger impact on the price.
Exactly. It's almost like Bitcoin is this coiled spring,
Yeah.
And the election could be that trigger that releases all that pent-up energy.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this fits together, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about the technical side of things for a minute. What are the charts actually telling us about Bitcoin's potential trajectory?
Well, like we said earlier, remember, Bitcoin tried to break through its previous all-time high, that $73,738 mark, after Harris announced her candidacy. It just couldn't stick the landing.
Right. It kind of bumped up against that ceiling.
Yeah. And you know what? That $60,000 to $80,000 range, it just keeps popping up as this really critical zone.
It's like Bitcoin's stuck in this holding pattern.
It kind of is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's mostly traded within that band since July, with one notable exception.
Oh, you're talking about that dip down to $49,000 back in August.
Exactly. But other than that, it's been pretty consistent, honestly.
So what's the technical outlook then? I mean, is Bitcoin likely to break out of that range, or is it going to stay stuck?
So right now, Bitcoin is in a short-term uptrend, meaning it's forming these higher highs and higher lows, which suggests it's got momentum behind it. And if it manages to break through that 73,738 resistance level, that previous all-time highs, it could easily make a run toward $80,000.
So it's all about breaking through that ceiling. And could this election be what finally sends it soaring?
It's possible. I mean, the technical indicators are definitely saying it's possible.
So we've got this potential undervaluation. Big investors are watching very, very closely. And we have the technical setup for a potential breakout. It really feels like this election could be the spark that ignites the next big move for Bitcoin.
It could. But remember, it's just one factor among many. And as we dig deeper into the nuances of this whole thing, we'll definitely uncover even more insights that will help you understand Bitcoin's true potential, regardless of who wins.
All right, I am officially hooked. Let's keep going. Okay, so we've really laid out the playing field now. Election bets are flying around. We've got candidates' crypto stances under the microscope, and charts, well, they're hinting at a potential Bitcoin surge. But, sometimes you need more than just data.
Yeah.
To really make sense of it all, you need to hear from some people out there in the trenches.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's bring in the wisdom of some experts. to help us shed light on this whole Bitcoin election situation.
Perfect. Because these are the folks who live and breathe this stuff every single day. They see the patterns, they understand the nuances, they can connect the dots that maybe, we might miss.
Exactly. So first up, we've got a spokesperson from BingX.
Okay.
Leading crypto exchange. They make this really interesting point about the short-term impact versus the long-term impact of the election. They basically say that, sure, the winner's stance on crypto, it might cause some price fluctuations right away. But the real game changer, it's the policies they actually put in place.
Yeah, it's kind of like that difference between a sugar rush and a balanced meal. You might get a quick burst of energy from the sugar, but it's the meal that sustains you in the long run.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And in the world of crypto, those balanced meals, we're talking policies that tackle inflation, policies that make it easier for people to invest in digital assets, and policies that really define how the U.S. interacts with other countries on crypto.
Makes sense. So it's not just about whether a candidate is pro-crypto or not. It's about those concrete actions they take to create a stable, supportive environment.
Exactly. Now, next up, we have Ryan Lee, chief analyst over at Bidget Research.
Okay.
He reminds us that uncertainty, it breeds volatility. So no matter who wins, the days and weeks after the election could be, a bit of a roller coaster for Bitcoin.
Oh yeah, buckle up, because when people aren't sure about the future, they get a little jittery with their investments.
For sure. So traders and investors need to be ready for some sudden swings. Could go either way. But Lee also brings up some interesting historical data here. He points out that crypto-related stocks like MicroStrategy, Robinhood, they've actually been climbing in the month leading up to the election.
That's interesting. So even with all this uncertainty, there's still a sense of optimism, at least in the crypto space.
It seems that way. Yeah, and it kind of suggests this broader belief that, crypto, especially Bitcoin, is here for the long haul, no matter what happens with the political climate.
That's a really good point. It's like people are saying, okay, the election might cause some short-term turbulence, but overall, crypto is on this upward trajectory.
Exactly. And that brings us to our next expert, Marcus Thielen, CEO of 10x Research. He throws us a bit of a curveball, actually. He argues that politics might actually be a secondary factor when it comes to Bitcoin's price movements.
Wait, really? He's saying the election might not be that big of a deal?
Well, that's what he's suggesting, yeah. He points to historical examples, like that 2011 bull run. It was driven more by things like the overall economy, not by specific political events.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, Bitcoin was born during the financial crisis of 2008. A time when people were losing faith in traditional systems.
Right. So maybe people are drawn to Bitcoin because they're looking for an alternative.
Yeah.
Something that's decentralized, outside the control of, governments and banks.
Exactly. And Thielen believes that focusing too much on the election, it might make us miss the forest for the trees.
Right.
He thinks we should be looking at bigger trends, like institutional adoption, which has been a major catalyst for Bitcoin's growth so far this year.
Right, so institutional adoption, that's when the big players like pension funds, hedge funds, they start getting involved with Bitcoin.
Exactly. Yeah, and he highlights BlackRock's application for a spot Bitcoin ETF.
Yeah.
This was a pivotal moment. BlackRock's the biggest asset manager in the world, so when they make a move like that, people notice.
Yeah. It's like a stamp of approval, right? Hey, Bitcoin's a legit investment.
Right. And that's potentially, that's huge for Bitcoin's future. Potentially even bigger than who wins the election.
So it sends a signal to the whole financial world, Bitcoin is here to stay.
Yeah.
And that could have a much larger ripple effect on the market than any single election.
Absolutely.
So let me just make sure I'm getting this straight. We have one expert saying, focus on the long-term policies, not the short-term hype. Another one saying, hey, be ready for some volatility, but don't lose sight of the overall, positive sentiment. And then Thielen saying, the election might not be the be-all, end-all, and we should be paying more attention to those bigger trends, like institutional adoption.
You got it. And I think what we can take away from all of this is that, yeah, the election might spice things up a little in the Bitcoin market, but the long-term trajectory, it's being driven by bigger forces, honestly. Things like institutional adoption, tech advancements, global macroeconomic trends. These are what will ultimately determine Bitcoin's success.
Okay, so it's like the election is a wave, but the tide of crypto is much, much bigger.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to circle back to a question we posed earlier.
Okay.
Considering everything we've discussed, what kind of policies do you think would actually move the needle for Bitcoin over the long haul?
Ooh, that's a question worth thinking about, right? Because the answer might actually surprise you. It might not just be about direct support, but about creating an environment where innovation can flourish.
Absolutely. We need policies that foster competition, protect investors, and encourage responsible adoption. That's what will really unlock Bitcoin's potential.
So as we head into, the final stretch of this election cycle, let's try to keep our eyes on the big picture. Bitcoin's journey, it's far from over. It's going to be a fascinating ride no matter who wins. But if we really want to understand where Bitcoin is headed, we need to go beyond those headlines, beyond the political noise, and focus on those fundamental forces that are shaping the future.
Well said. And speaking of looking beyond the headlines, we've got some interesting insights to share
Okay.
about other factors that could have a huge impact on Bitcoin in the years to come. Things that go way beyond this election.
Ooh, okay, I am intrigued. Let's dive in. Okay, so we've really dug deep into all the data. We've heard from the experts. Now it's time to bring it all home. We've been talking about how this election has really kind of cast a shadow over the crypto world, prediction markets going crazy, institutional investors making these big moves based on, who they think might win.
Yeah, and it's clear that, whoever wins this election, it could definitely shake things up in the short term.
Right.
But like we've been hearing from the experts, it's important to keep things in perspective.
Absolutely, because whether it's Trump or Harris in the White House, yeah, it might give Bitcoin a temporary boost or a dip, but the things that are really driving growth, they're much bigger than that.
Right, they are. Things like, institutional adoption. Think about technological innovation, this global shift toward digital assets. These are the forces that are going to shape the crypto landscape for years to come, regardless of who's sitting in the Oval Office.
It's like we're watching a rocket launch, right?
Yeah.
The election, that might be the initial ignition, but it's those powerful engines that are going to propel the rocket into space.
That's a great analogy. And so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question to consider. We've explored the impact of the election, but what other factors might have a big influence on Bitcoin in the future? What are the things that keep you up at night?
Yeah, what's on the horizon? What could really rock the crypto world?
Well, one thing that I find really fascinating is this whole rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
Oh yeah, CBDCs. I've heard that term a lot lately, but honestly, I'm still a little fuzzy on what they actually are. Can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. Imagine if governments issued their own digital versions of their currencies.
Okay.
So that's basically what a CBDC is, like a digital dollar or a euro yuan, backed by the full faith and credit of the government.
So it's like a government-issued stablecoin, kind of.
Exactly. And this raises some, I think, really interesting questions about the future of money in general. How would CBDCs coexist with, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? Would they compete with each other, or they actually complement each other?
Yeah, because, Bitcoin was designed to be decentralized, right?
Right.
Outside the control of governments. So would the introduction of CBDCs, would that undermine that fundamental principle of Bitcoin?
It's one of the big debates going on right now. And some people believe that CBDCs could actually help legitimize cryptocurrencies.
Oh, interesting.
Make them more accessible to the mainstream. Others worry that it might give governments too much control over people's finances.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's like a double-edged sword, right?
It is.
On the one hand, it could make crypto more user-friendly, but then on the other hand, it could also kind of erode some of those freedoms that make crypto so attractive in the first place.
Exactly. And honestly, this is just one example of the factors that could really have a big impact on Bitcoin in the years to come. We haven't even talked about things like the growing connection between crypto and AI, or the environmental sustainability of Bitcoin mining.
Wow, it's really mind-boggling when you think about all the possibilities out there, all the potential twists and turns.
It really is. But that's what makes this whole space so exciting. It's constantly evolving, constantly challenging our assumptions about money, technology, and the future. And as you continue, your own deep dive into this world, I really encourage you, just keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep an open mind. Because the future of Bitcoin and the whole crypto ecosystem, it's being written right now. And the story, well, it's far from over.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this journey into the world of Bitcoin and the U.S. election. We've covered so much ground, from the, psychology of crypto traders to the impact of government policies. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface. So keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive, where we'll continue to, dive deep into the most interesting topics that are shaping our world.